here. Yes, it's been a crazy morning since I had no electricity and no internet for the last 40 minutes or so. So I missed most of your introductions, unfortunately. I got bits and pieces here and there. But here we go. I'm talking to you about legal planning for your future. I'm a lawyer, and as we saw, there were a few lawyers in the group today. And interestingly, we each have our own little field or our own field of expertise. When you're looking for a lawyer, you don't want a koboinik. And I don't know if all of you guys know that word, but it generally means sort of a jack of all trades or someone that does a little bit of everything. You want someone who's an expert in their field. Um, so I'm going to talk first a little bit about me, and then I'll talk about my field. I was born in New York, but my family made Aliyah when I was 3. So I was lucky enough to become fully bilingual, go through the Israeli schooling system. I studied law in Bar-Ilan University. I have 3 adorable children, as you see in the picture. And my husband told me to say this, my very hot husband. So I'm practicing law since 2007, and I'm a notary since 2018. Now, what are we going to talk about today? My field is within the specific field of family law, and then within family law, there's another subcategory of wills and inheritance. Enduring power of attorney, it's basically planning for the future, planning for the unknown. I don't know if we'll get to touch upon all of these things today. We're going to start with wills and inheritance and what you need to know about that. Now, everybody could wrap their head around the idea of someone in their 70s sitting down and writing a will. Maybe even a bit earlier, it makes sense to start planning. But when we're in our 30s and 40s, really, we're not thinking about dying, right? It's just something we just tend to ignore. We're going to live forever. We'll die another day. But unfortunately, as Benjamin Franklin said, there are only 2 things that are certain in life, and that is death and taxes. And we don't know when death is going to come. So now that we're faced with our mortality, let's talk about what happens to our stuff when we die. Okay? Now, the law puts a default arrangement in place of what happens to our stuff if we don't write a will, right? Because the law says, well, we can only assume what you would want to happen to your things if you don't tell us. So here's an example of what would happen. Let's take a nice little family, all right? I called the parents Jack and Jill, and they have 3 little children, Huey, Dewey, and Louie, okay? What would happen if Jack dies? Jack's estate is basically every single thing that he owns when he passes away. So that would include his bank accounts, investments, home, all the things, every right he might have is part of his estate. And then his estate would be divided. If he died without a will, 50% would go to his wife, and 50% would go to his kids. So if we're talking about a house, and let's assume he owns 50% of the house because Jill owns the other 50%, then his half of the house is part of his estate, and that gets divided. Once again, half goes to Jill. Jill ends up with 75% of the house, and the kids split the other 25% in equal portions between them. Okay, so this is true for the house, it's true for joint bank accounts. Anything he has would get divided half to the wife, half to the kids, and then the kids divide that. So that might seem like a decent arrangement that sort of makes sense, right? That's generally who we want to leave our assets to our close family members. But there are some problems with the default arrangement by law. What are some of those problems? First of all, if the kids are under 18, then the court looks out for their rights and their interests, and anything that mom Jill would want to do with their money or with their assets would require court approval. So if she wanted to sell the house, downsize, move somewhere else, make a change in life, she would require court approval to sell her property. And she could get it, but the court would either make sure that she's buying a new property and giving them equal rights there, or that their share of the proceeds is getting locked up until they're adults. So that is extra bureaucracy, extra cost, and can definitely make life harder on Jill. Now let's assume her kids are older and they're adults. That's great. But now they become partners essentially in her home and in her money, and she is subject to their own goodwill. And if they want to realize their portion of the house, right? Let's say they want to take that money to buy their own place or to travel the world or start a business. And if she doesn't have the ability to buy them out, they might be able to force her to sell. And that obviously would not be a very good outcome for Jill. And even if the kids are wonderful kids and they would never do that to their mom, let's say Huey started a business and he took out some loans, and unfortunately, economy being what it is, his business failed. And now he has creditors of, let's say, 400,000 or 500,000 shekel. His creditors can then reach the 8.3% of Jill's house that belongs to Huey. And that once again puts her at a risk. Another problem with not having a will is that you're not customizing your wishes. There's so many different things that can go into a will to express and make sure that what you want happening after you die happens. For example, there was a grandma with an apartment in Israel, and she really, really wanted her grandkids to make Aliyah. So she put in the will that they can't sell the apartment for 4 years. And that way it would encourage them to come into Israel, stay in this apartment, and maybe make Aliyah. She can do that, okay? Not to say not selling forever and ever, but for 4 years, it's a legitimate limitation put in place. Another example, let's say we're talking about a couple whose kids are young adults, okay? Maybe in their 20s, maybe the older child is already married and settled down. And they helped him when he was purchasing a home, and they gave him, let's say, 400,000 shekel towards a house. They haven't given that money to their other kids who are younger and not really ready to settle down. But they want to make sure to put an instruction in the will saying, if any of my kids haven't yet gotten assistance to purchase a place, first give them an equal amount and then divide the rest, right? First take 400,000 off the top for the other kid and then divide it. If you don't have a will, then that's lost. Another example, of course, is a case when someone has a child with special needs, and either maybe they need additional financial support, or maybe they're not able to handle their finances and they want to appoint someone else, maybe a trusted sibling, to hold the money in trust for them and look out for them. So those are all just different examples of why it would be a good idea to have a will. One little point on the bottom is going back to Huey, Dewey, and Louie, who have 8.3%. Even if they're great and they say, sure, mom, we'll live in the house. We don't want anything from you. Stay there as long as you want, as long as you need. They officially have 8.3% of the house, and that may hurt their eligibility for maybe grants or loans or different things along the way when they have to show what assets they have. Now, that was assuming a classic family structure of spouse and kids. What happens if someone doesn't have kids? The law has arrangements in place for that as well. Putting aside the spouse for a second, if someone dies without kids, their parents might inherit, their siblings, then we even go further to grandparents, aunts, uncles, nieces, and nephews. I don't want to waste too much time getting into the details here. And I will say the spouse in such a case does inherit along with the other family members, and the spouse would either take 50% or 2/3, sometimes inheriting the entire apartment as well. She takes the car and the contents as well. Now that sounds that it can make sense all in all, but the question comes up, what is a spouse, right? So if you're married, it's very clear cut, very straightforward. You have a spouse. The question comes up when we're talking about common law spouses, known in Hebrew as Yeduim Batzibur. And the question is, when do you move from dating to girlfriend, boyfriend to partners that actually intend to share property and share rights? And it's very easy when maybe they're together for 20 years and have kids together, but it suddenly becomes less clear when they're not together as long. Now, here's a true story. There was a nice man who had a first wife, happy life, they raised kids together, and unfortunately, wife number one passed away. He was sad, he was lonely, he mourned her. He was lucky enough to meet wife number two, was happy with her, wonderful. She too passed away. By now, we're talking about an old man. He was alone, he wasn't leaving the house. And then he met a nice woman, and he started dating, and he started getting out, and he went on vacations with her, and his children were thrilled. Finally, someone is there to look after Pops, take care of him and everything. And they moved in together, right? And 3 months after they move in together, our old guy dies. And our old guy did not have a will, and along came new girlfriend and said, I'm his common law spouse. And the courts recognized it. And she took half of his estate because he did not have a will. Okay, so that was an extreme case, but there have also been cases where people have been recognized as common law spouses, even though they don't actually live together, right? They each keep their own place. Sometimes we're here, sometimes we're there. So that is just a quick cautionary tale. Okay, what goes into a will? right? So if we're talking about a couple, we talk about what happens if one of us dies first, what happens if we both die. If we have small children, we talk about legal guardians. Who would we want raising our kids instead of us if, God forbid, something happened to both of us? And who would be the trustees for the children? Who would handle their money? It does not have to be the same people raising them and handling the assets. As a couple, you have the option of creating a mutual will where you're counting on each other, and you could put all kinds of different limitations in place for that. So that's definitely something to think about. And of course, part of the process is discussing assets abroad, who you're going to appoint as executors. And when someone is interested in making their will halachically kosher, so to speak, there's an extra document to do that as well. Okay. Now, when someone comes to me for writing a will, that is not the only document that I write up. It's part of a broader plan, and part of that plan is things that are outside of the will. For example, all of our pensions, Kronat Hishtalmut, Kupot Gimel, all those things are considered external to our estate, and there we list mutavim. Okay, we list beneficiaries. Here too, another true story. A young guy got married. The marriage failed. After 2-3 years, they got divorced. He didn't even have kids with wife number one. He remarried wife number two, had a family, kids living together, married for decades. And he was responsible. And he made a will and he said, I'm leaving everything to wife number two. But lo and behold, after he died, notice that in all these stories, it's the men who die. But after he died, they discovered that he opened a Keren Hishtalmut when he was married to wife number one, listed her as a beneficiary, and never updated. And she stood to walk away with hundreds of thousands of shekels that were built up in there. Because he thought he was being responsible in writing a will, but he forgot about this policy and did not take care of it. Of course, wife number two would not have that. They battled it out. The court came up with a creative solution, but you don't want to have to do that. You want to get, you don't want to have to go to court to get your rights and spend money on lawyers, right? Another quick thing to think of is if you have a joint bank account, you want to have a Sefer Yichud Yamim. That's just to make sure the account isn't completely frozen when one partner passes away. Most accounts have that nowadays. But accounts that were open a long time ago may or may not. And another thing to consider is digital assets, okay? So digital assets could be anything from your Google accounts, your Google Photos, right? Your Gmail, your social media accounts, all those different things. And here, let's be honest, law is way behind technology. So a lot of times the easiest solutions here are not a legal solution per se, but something external to it. For example, sharing your password with your spouse, okay, or having them know where to find it so they can access your emails or whatever they need to find. A lot of the mega corporations like Google has an option that you can name someone who would access certain information if your account would become inactive after a certain amount of time. So that's very easy. You go into your Google settings and you can put that in place. On Facebook, you can name someone who could memorialize your page for you. After someone passes away, their page could become memorialized. And then people could post memories, pictures, different things. So there's different plans that could be put in place, which again is not part of the legal document, but part of the process. Now, a lot of people often ask me, they're like, well, could I just do it on my own? Could I just write on a piece of paper and sign it? And is that a will? Or could I just make a video of myself saying what I want, and would that count? So surprisingly, a video is not a valid will, but scribbling something on a piece of paper is. As I said, law behind technology. And people have done that, but I wouldn't recommend it, of course. Why wouldn't I recommend it? First of all, mistakes happen. Just a few months ago, I went to see an older couple in Yerushalayim for preparing a enduring power of attorney, and he showed me this meticulously handwritten will that he prepared. Now, these guys were financially well off. They owned their apartment in Yerushalayim right out. They had substantial savings in the States and all kinds of investments in different places. And he wrote in his will, I leave 1/5 of everything I have to a charitable organization, right? And he named an organization, which sounds really nice, wonderful, generous, okay? He also left some money to a friend, and then over the years, he wanted to change the amount, so he scribbled out the amount and then changed it to another one. This will was a disaster waiting to happen, but because of the way he worded it, he was effectively giving this charitable organization 1/5 of every asset, 1/5 of his home, 1/5 of his investments here, 1/5 of his investments there, and basically this organization was going to become part of the family as far as taking everything from every single asset and controlling it from when the house would be sold and so on and so forth. So mistakes can happen and you don't know what you don't know, right? As I mentioned, we have the option of mutual wills, putting different limitations in place. There's a concept of successive beneficiaries, right? I could say I'm leaving everything to my husband, and after he passes away, it has to pass on to my kids. A lot of people aren't aware of that option. And as I've once mentioned before, transferring your estate after you die is actually the biggest transaction of your life, and you want to do it right. That's as far as wills go. There's so much to say, but I don't want to take too long. The other aspect of the things that I do is talking about preparing for old age. Now here, if you see in this table right over here in 2020, there are 5.8 million people in the States diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And if we hop on over to 2040, that is going to double in the next 20 years. It's no secret that people are living longer. And unfortunately, there is no cure yet for dementia and Alzheimer's. So really, people have to come up with a plan and think about how their life is going to look, because you could live for many years in a state of dementia at all kinds of different levels of impaired cognitive skills, right? So Israel has an enduring power of attorney option, which came into law a few years ago, which helps you because you make your wishes clear of what you would want to happen down the line if you were in such a case. It helps your family members because it could prevent disagreements. You could avoid bureaucracy, make the burden for your children a little bit lighter. It's not easy to take care of an aging parent. And it allows you to plan for all categories, for medical, for financial, for personal decisions. It's highly customizable because you choose who you're appointing, what you're appointing them for, who's going to decide when the power of attorney goes into effect. And it helps prevent, to an extent, a certain bureaucratic involvement. And lastly, there's a whole other set of documents to talk about end-of-life decisions in Israel, which is honestly limited in scope. And I'm sure this doesn't come as a surprise that in Israel, there's absolutely no option of actively hastening someone's end of life. You can just refrain from artificially prolonging. And there's two main types of documents here. One is a power of attorney where you say, I'm appointing so-and-so to make that decision for me down the line when I can't make it myself. And another document here, which you see here, is basically you're making your wishes known in advance. You're saying, if I'm in a state where I'm a terminally ill patient, refrain or don't refrain from all these different treatments here. Now, I'm not going to get into it because I've spoken long enough. Okay, so people who have questions can ask that. Now, I want to talk a little bit about my business and how I work. So I largely operate as a classic law firm would, right? Someone calls me up and they say, oh, I need a will, I need a power of attorney. We set up a meeting, we discuss and move on. But I realized a few months ago that I kept repeating myself at these meetings because it's really important for me to give my clients a lot of information so they can make informed decisions. So anytime a couple would come to me and they still have minor children, there was a whole slew of topics that we would discuss that would need to be thought about when writing a will. And then I said, okay, people in their 30s and their 40s don't really want to sit and write their wills. How do I make this, first of all, more cost effective and a little bit more fun? Enter the will workshop. So in the will workshop, I grouped together a few people who fit the same general category, right? Like couples with small children. And then the first session we have is informative only, so they're not sharing any personal information. And I'm just giving them a lot of information, things to think about. They leave that with a worksheet of questions to answer, information to gather, and then the rest of the process is completely personal and confidential. I meet with them, each one individually one-on-one. We discuss their needs, concerns, decisions, and I take it from there. So I've done workshops for that category. And now there's, I'm working on my single parents category because they have their own set of concerns. And a few people asked me to do that. And actually people approached me over 60 and said, we want a workshop too. So those are the things I'm working on now. And if you know people who might be interested in these workshops, please do send them my way. Thank you. Questions?
Do you want to stop sharing your screen, Miriam, so we can see it a bit better? Sorry. Does anyone have any questions for Miriam? Leora.
Yeah, first of all, thank you. It was really interesting and very timely. I just wanted to ask you, if you don't mind, how much does it cost to come to a workshop?
To the workshop.
Yeah.
Okay. So for the workshop for the couples, costs 3,700. Okay, that's 1,000 shekel less than what I charge for a couple to come to me directly.
Mm-hmm.
I don't yet have a final price for the single parents workshop. Okay, but that's roughly ballpark. Okay.
Okay.
Any more questions? Jason.
So firstly, thank you, Miriam, for discussing this. I think oftentimes, we don't like to think about death, and we just think, oh, well, we'll do it someday. And then of course, like, death creeps up on us, and we haven't done anything. My dad is an accountant in South Africa, and he deals so much with disputes, and really, it's sad, but these types of things can destroy families. When people have gone, and you have money in the mix, so like oftentimes siblings and things like that, they can be fights over money. When I know my dad has a will, for example, when a family, when parents make a will, do you recommend that they like share that with the children so that they're not surprised by any of the decisions? Or what can me also, as a young person, I don't know anything personally about like my parents' will. Should I ask my parents and get involved and have a discussion with them about what's in there so that none of my siblings and me are surprised by that?
Okay, that's a really good question. And actually, you'll get different answers, obviously, from different lawyers, but also it varies from country to country. There are some countries where it's considered almost standard to sort of make it a family type of thing. They'll gather the kids, discuss. That's less common in Israel because there is a concern that anybody who is involved, actively involved in the process of writing the will, could be seen as unduly influencing their parents. Right? So you have to sort of be careful on how you do it. Now, as far as, it doesn't mean every single involvement would automatically cut you out of the will, okay? But it is a little bit of a delicate dynamic. Now, do I recommend that people share certain things with their kids? It really depends. If it's something that's fairly straightforward, where no kid stands to be surprised and upset, right? This is like maybe a very imbalanced divide, then I would say there's no need to share. You can, but it's not anything, so no one's going to be too shocked, right? But I do have a case where the couple had two children, a son and a daughter. The son did very well for himself. He was very well off, and they decided to leave the apartment just to the daughter. So, and again, they could choose to do that and not say anything to the kids, and just, let them deal with it after we're gone, their problem, right? And they may say, because if I bring it up now, he's going to make us crazy, and it's going to just cause a lot of problems. But in that case, it actually worked well to bring it up with the kids because they all had good relationships, and the son was so fine with it. He was absolutely fine with it. He really didn't need his half of that house. And that way, it really was smooth and simple, and it was good. Interestingly, a lot of times when people come to me and they say, well, I want to give a little bit more to this, a little bit more to that, I always say there is so much emotion attached to a will, okay? And a lot of times when things are not super perfect between siblings, it tends to explode after the parents pass away. Children sometimes try to play nice while the parents are still alive, but then after they're gone, these things come out. He always preferred you. He always did that. They always gave you more. And so if they're sensing that there's going to be a problem, it definitely could be discussed in advance.
That's so true. And like, I'll say, like, me and my brothers and my family, we're actually a very tight family, but because my dad's an accountant, he has told me many stories about very close families, and then they don't know the will because it's not like they just never asked. I've never even thought to ask my parents about this until you've had this conversation. Like, oh, actually, like, I know that that's divided equally, but I don't know anything about that. I don't even know who would be in charge if, God forbid, both my parents died at the same time. I don't know who would be in charge of anything. And that's why I'm asking these questions, like,
It also depends on your relationship with your father and what you guys do or don't talk about in the family, right? For some people, it might be very awkward to bring up. Some people, They, you know, are afraid to talk about death completely, and they're like, oh, don't talk about it, don't, you know, like they're completely afraid to bring it up. So it really is a personal choice. But if you feel that you would want to, you absolutely can ask them just to know what the plan is.
Awesome.
Good question.
Yeah, go for it.
Miriam, when you have a young family and your family is growing, God willing, like how do you handle that? Like every time you have a kid, do you need to adjust things, or is there kind of like a standard that whoever is in the family?
Great question. Because people don't like writing wills, right? We don't want to have to do them every year, every other year, right? Not even every 5 years. So we try to give the will as long a shelf life as possible, right? But I always tell people any major life change, right, which would be adding someone to the family, or God forbid if someone is no longer around in the family, is definitely a good time to look at the will, make sure it's still relevant, see if anything needs to be updated. So in a situation where maybe someone comes to me and they have a few children, but they're hoping to have more, we would list the children with their names and Teudat Zehut, the ones who are already born, and I would add it explicitly saying, you know, any additional children I have after this will is signed would also be included and would inherit equally. It's easier to have them then updated with their names and Teudat Zehut, but just in case they didn't get around to it, because guess what, when you have a baby, you're not saying, oh, I gotta go over my will. So we address it, and once again, update it if needed.
Great, thank you.
And Martha.
So first of all, great presentation. I love the concept of workshops. It sounds like you can help more people in less time, and it works for you too. So really, I can definitely tell you know what you're talking about. That being said, in my last networking group, this was first brought to my attention about 4 years ago, and I was like, oh my gosh, do my parents have a will? So similar in relation to Jason's question, I asked them, they didn't. Mom didn't want to think about it, Dad kind of sort of whatever. But I don't think progress has been made. I hadn't brought it up. What I'm asking is, first of all, when are your workshops available to people internationally? And two, are you able to serve people internationally if they feel like it's a good fit? Because I know that a will is definitely
okay, right. So part of the things I'm trying to do is raise awareness to the importance of having a will. Theoretically, I could serve people internationally, in that I do have clients abroad, but I practice only Israeli law. So I can serve them with respect to Israeli law. So even if they live abroad, but if they have any asset in Israel, they would need an Israeli will, and I can help them with that. But if you're talking about, Jason, I don't know, I think your parents, are they South Africa or something?
Yeah, my family lives in South Africa.
Right, so if they're South African and all their assets are in South Africa, I personally can't help them.
Any more questions? Miriam, that was fantastic. I think a round of applause for
Thank
Miriam.
you.
That was
I'm
really
glad my electricity held up.
That was fantastic. I know the whole time I was like, is it going to work? I was like, okay, this seems to be smooth. It was absolutely fantastic. Really well presented. Really, I found it genuinely fascinating and different from English law as well, which is interesting. So I'm now going to, once again, put everybody into breakout rooms. I think we will have chance for a third. So if there is anybody you want to speak to, please do message me, because I will be arranging third breakout room shortly. It's now 11:10, so I'll bring you out at 11:20. So in 3, 2, 1, yalla. I'm gonna start playing music at this time. Maybe. Just me. Okay. I'll stop recording this now.